Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Will, Piyush, Ali, and I were talking backstage. We had a moment of concern where we realized, what are we going to talk about? Peter sang all of our best lines during the opening. So I guess we'll just have to chat. No, we've got plenty to talk about today. I'm really excited to talk about it. So again, the topic of this panel is face the F word. And specifically, that F word is a 5-letter F word that has inspired a lot of 4-letter F words over the last few years, which is fraud. And of course, fraud, as we mentioned and have talked about already a lot today, is something that impacts all of us here in the marketing technology space, in the advertising space in general. And it's not often talked about in contexts like this. But to borrow a phrase from Ian Sufferman, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And so we're extremely happy to have 3 different perspectives on what fraud means in our industry right now and what we're doing to combat it, going from the advertiser, the agency, and the ad platform perspective to hear about how it's affecting us, what we can do to fight it, what we need to do to get educated, and just how we go on from here. And so allow me to first allow the panel to introduce themselves, starting with Will.
Hey, so I'm Will Phung. I lead the media practice in the US for MNC Saatchi Mobile.
Hey, hi, I'm Piyush. I'm the Chief Product Officer for InMobi. Pretty excited to be here. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Ollie Mills. I am the Global Mobile Marketing Manager for Hotels.com.
Great, and so jumping right into it. So, of course, the thing about fraud is that, especially in this industry, it has a lot of definitions. It can be, of course, very scary and also very amorphous in terms of what people mean when they say the word fraud and how it impacts them specifically. So I'd love to hear from the 3 of you your thoughts about what fraud means to you and the kinds of things that you're encountering. So starting with you, Piyush, so talking from the supply side, from the ad platform side, when the word fraud comes up, what does that mean to you and how is that impacting you on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of fraud, I actually think nowadays of global drug trade. I think if in terms of organized crime, I would say fraud is now only second to global drug trade, and if it just left unchecked, it's going to be like $50 billion of ad fraud in the next 10, 5, 15 years. So it's pretty big and large. I think for us as an ad partner, as InMobi, I think the key point is fraud is not just a last mile problem. Most of the fraud that's being talked about today is at the post-click, at the install fraud level. And we feel that there's a lot more happening upstream, right from the publisher source, right at the request, impression, click level, that's very much left undetected. So most of the ecosystem, most of the tracking partners, advertisers are still looking at the downstream metrics on fraud. You know what? That's just 20% of the problem. There's 80% of the problem that is out there on the source, at the request level, at impression level, that's happening for various means like ad stacking and subletting and a bunch of these things we can talk about. But I think what you guys see as fraud today, downstream is just the tip of the iceberg. And what is lying below, what is invisible down there is far more dangerous and far more, and it just affects advertisers' budgets, it affects clean networks like us. So that's what I think about fraud. So there's a lot more to talk about that side.
Right, it's all up and down the stream, all up and down the funnel, definitely, in a really diverse number of areas where it can apply. So, Will, from your perspective now, from the agency perspective of trying to get the best performance you possibly can, when you hear the word fraud, what's the meaning to you, and how is that affecting your day-to-day?
So when we think about fraud, it is really any time that you are not receiving what you have contracted to purchase, right? And I think that is a wider view of fraud than some people take of it. You talk about click spamming, ad stacking. That's a type of fraud. But I would also say if you have contracted to purchase non-incentivized inventory and you're winding up on an offer wall, that is fraud. If you've contracted to have impressions served in the UK and you wind up being served in Russia, that is fraud. At the widest, if you're contracting to target mothers and you're receiving impressions targeted to fathers intentionally, that is fraud, right? And that's the other distinction that I would make, and I think it helps in the conversations with partners like InMobi. Intent is important, right? If there was a bug or a glitch or just honestly a human error that ends up where your impression is served in Russia instead of the UK. That is not fraud. There has to be intent behind it, and I think that can help. Part of what Peter talked about is hostility. I think that helps lower the hostility to figure out, was somebody actively trying to defraud us here, or is this an actual error which does happen in the industry?
Right. There's I know a term called Napoleon's Law, which is never attribute to malice what can first be attributed to incompetence.
Exactly.
Which I know is always at play. So, Ollie, now from your perspective as an advertiser, so actually going out there and trying to get the most growth you possibly can, what does fraud mean to you, and how are you encountering it?
Yeah, so I think Will said it pretty similarly, but for us, it's essentially paying for installs and any activities when we would have got those for free or naturally anyway. And I think that just generally for us, it's the issue of the cannibalization of our own organic, natural interest in our app and our product, and using the techniques you talked about further up the funnel, publishers are able to gain kind of attribution and get credit for that stuff using a whole bunch of kind of nefarious means, claim credit for these really impressive looking installs, great customers, they look great, and we're all too eager to say we did a great job, but then what fraud really is those people who serve that ad initially can say, well done, you did a great job, we served that ad, and someone clicked on it, and now that person is making loads of transactions and it looks like a great customer. Essentially to us, that's what we face with fraud pretty much all the time, and it's just paying our budget, our carefully managed budget, for things that just naturally occur anyway, and those great customers are coming to us naturally. We're just using the limitations of the current system we have in mobile attribution at the moment, or they're using their limitations to really game that and take advantage of getting in there with that probabilistic nature of the attribution method at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, now, Ollie, you're touching on something that's really interesting, which are the telltales, the trail that's left behind. Or in this case, right, some of the ways in which it gets masked by having legitimate users that look like they came from legitimate traffic that was actually claiming users you would have had anyway. And so my next question is around what are the telltales? So of course we're in the technology space, we're constantly dealing with vast streams of data, that's how we all find our advantage and find our edge. So when it comes to working with the data, how is fraud showing up in your data, or how do you use data as a way of identifying what is going on out there? And so, Will, do you want to start there?
Sure. It is a lot of effort, right? And I think that's one huge barrier, and it's something that I think people that commit fraud are preying on, is that we're all very busy, and you're investing a ton of man hours. You have to invest a ton of man hours to really dig in and look at these specific data points that show fraud. Some of the ones that we've looked at a lot. One easy example is, let's look at the distribution of activity, whether it be clicks or installs or whatever, by time of day, right? If you're seeing that, hey, all of a sudden, I'm getting a ton at 3 a.m., that is a very easy way to look at it. And then it's about digging in, beyond just overall. Let's look at the specific partners, let's look at sub-IDs, but I think there are also things that you learn as you go, like, oh, these are things that we should look at. One example I like to give is we had a partner, won't name names, but they showed us a list of, hey, these are the top 10 apps where all of your installs are coming from. And we looked like, hey, this is a great list. I can't wait to show this to the client. And you show it to the client and you say, hey, this app that's number one, that doesn't exist in my country. And you live and learn. It's like, hey, that is a great idea. Now that's something that you can always cross-check against. You tell your partners, show me where the apps are, and then also show me the user base for this app in that country.
Got it. Now, Ollie, I know we've talked a fair bit about this, but when it comes to how you're seeing data, so you mentioned one of those cases of finding organic users who look great, but maybe aren't actually from the places where they claim to be through things like click stuffing. How else are you seeing it reflected in your data from the advertiser side?
Yeah, so I think the obvious one, first of all, is you can just see crazy click to install rates. I mean, it is getting more complex now. People are getting smarter about it, but any immediate warning signs are just high numbers of clicks. Like we wouldn't expect to get like that crazy amount of clicks compared to those kind of installs. So that's really an example for us, and probably one of the most obvious ones to spot, but very quick solution is where they just spam out a whole bunch of clicks, hoping to fish in any kind of organics that they can, organic installs that they can match to. So definitely for us, we're looking at that. We're looking at the click to install time, which is an obvious one again, just under kind of 10 to 15 seconds. The click to install time doesn't seem wholly legitimate. Mm-hmm. And then we see a very long tail off time as well. Pretty much a flat curve. I know there was some click to install curves shown earlier, but that's a really great indication of just if you have that 24-hour fingerprint window where you're collecting attribution for all this activity, if you just see it flat and now you're getting installs 20 hours, 18 hours after the click, that partner is doing something to try and game that kind of probabilistic system. But just quickly, I think that's a great point that Will raised on this, is that there is a huge time investment in looking at this data because it's all very raw data, and we're all very eager to show great results, and the last thing you want to do is spend all your time just proving that your results weren't actually that great. But I do think it's really worth diving into some of the obvious levers and measurements and just see, because it can't carry on this long. Like, the metrics are there, like it's very easy to jump in, but it just takes that time-consuming process to just weed out the networks and really examine your own process. So yeah.
Now, Piyush, from your perspective, there's a whole different set of challenges because you've got to manage your supply, you've got to manage different publishers, you've got to manage all the different ways in which your platform is trying to provide a service for its customers. What are the ways in which fraud is represented in your data, and how is it identifiable there?
Yeah, what we really, again, talk about is there's a lot of the metrics that people are today seeing as an ecosystem are, in our opinion, not good enough, because most of the metrics that today are there, and again, from the tracking partners or otherwise, are still talking about downstream, reactive, post-install, install level metrics. And that, to me, is more detection, not prevention. So what are the leading indicators of those metrics? Mean time to install, as we all understand and know, it is good, but it's not good enough. No. Because what you're really looking about is what happened at the install level, but what portion of what that happened earlier is much more important. In many cases, by the way, ironically, for advertisers and attribution partners who rely solely on MTTI, they're actually making a huge mistake, because a lot of clean ad networks who make a lot more stringent fraud checks upstream, whether it's at the impression level, request level, or click level, we get a lot more penalized because we'll always have worse off MTTI metrics than the other guys who have not done those stringent checks upfront itself, seen huge click volume going down, and showing a lot more better MTTI metrics. So I think that metric is okay. The real question for all of us, for advertisers, is what are the right kind of metrics that denote true incrementality? Because that's what we really care about, right? And to us, I feel those metrics are the ones that's more downstream. Things like mean click to install. How many clicks did it take? You talked about that. I would go further beyond. Mean number of impressions taken for the install. What percentage of new users did you really access uniquely? I think all these 3-4 metrics are more leading indicators, more upstream metrics that truly show the efficiency of your ad platform, the qualitative reach of the ad platform. And to us, I think those collectively are far more relevant as we go along than just downstream metrics. So that's what I think is being seen nowadays. And a lot of this transparency that's coming out there is showing that, 70% of the problem is up there, and that's what you should demand from your client, from your partners.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. You bring up something really interesting there at the beginning, which is, right, there's something of a prisoner's dilemma that happens because for those who are out there, who are doing some black hat things, it makes things harder for everyone else because of the noise it introduces to the data and everything else along those lines, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. So, Ollie, one of the things you mentioned is that, right, there's a bit of a cat and mouse game going, and both the cat and the mouse are getting a little more sophisticated over time. So what are some ways you feel that this has changed in the last few years? New things that you've seen where the cat and mouse game of fraud has changed up?
Sure. So I'm sure these two guys, Piyush and Will, can talk more about the full technology that is being used on the kind of the individual publisher level and what's being used more upstream that way. But in terms of us, like in the last few years, we've been really kind of cracking down on this and being very strict and being very stringent in looking at each individual network we work with and that kind of granular level going down to sub-publisher. But we really have not actually seen, from an advertiser point of view, that world develop that much. It's still the same. For us, it's kind of, we're stuck because, we are in the same position we were, a couple of years ago. We have to try expand out, try a network, and then the telltale signs start appearing, the obvious ones. Like, it's not that hard to pick out some quite obvious signs of this stuff, and because there's not, you talked about it, but there's not that transparency where we can really dig in and say this individual sub-publisher needs to be blacklisted, or we need to go down into the specific person who's doing this and cut them out and work with the network specifically. There's more of a protection of sources and a anonymity that that wants to be maintained from that stuff, because they don't want us obviously going direct or anything like that. But that kind of stuff has led us to be in a situation where we have to kind of just try, experiment, and then often have to just analyze the data in the same way we have been doing, and then pull back or do a small scale continuation of that. Like, we haven't really been able to, or I think from our close examination of all this stuff, we have not found the kind of the playing field at the moment has really been conducive to really growing in a natural, healthy way. There's still a lot of black hat stuff, and because you mentioned there's one sub-publisher in amongst the sea of all the publishers, we can't just call out that one person and say everything else is great. We have to really go in with a brute force approach and then pull back out. So that's where we're kind of at the moment.
Got it. And Will, from your perspective, so talking about the tools and about the kind of efforts along those lines to be able to tease out what is most effective, what is highest performing given the way in which fraud is evolving. What has changed here over the last few years in terms of fraud that you're seeing, or efforts that are involved, or just how the space has evolved in the last few years?
I think where we're moving to, as we've said a couple of times, the metrics are there. You kind of, if you think about it, what metrics to look at. It is a challenge of investing the man hours to look at those metrics. The next step, as it always is to move from relying on humans to relying on machines, right? We'll move over to our AI overlords, and it behooves us to create tools that will look at things like sub-publisher ID, and instead of having to have one person spend their entire day and invest in just looking at that every day, you create a machine that will actually ping that and send the report out to you. It's looking at, are there irregularities in, MTTI, for example, right? In mean time to install, mean time to your first purchase. And I think that's where we have to go. We as white hats, as the good guys, we don't have the time to invest in fraud. The black hats, this is all they do. That is, they wake up every day and they think, I'm gonna fraud somebody today, and we can't. We have many other things to do. So we need to create tools, and we need to, as an industry, come as we're gonna invest the money in creating tools, because that won't be free either.
Got it. Piyush, what's your take on this in terms of how things are evolving, especially from your end on the supply side?
Well, I would say what's really changing is the sophistication out there. I mean, it's in waves, Every 6 months, you talk about one metric. By that time, people have figured out more ways and more loopholes. So that whole waves of sophistication has increased beyond just click and install. I mean, people are now somewhere able to fake post-install transaction events in many parts of the world. And it's all crazy in terms of how this is happening. So I think the whole spectrum has become more sophisticated. Earlier, it was a lot about volume. It's now become a lot more about velocity and how things are sort of changing in that sense. The other thing you're seeing a lot is fraud for the newer media like video and audiences. I mean, you talked about that as also a fraud. I mean, if you're promising that this is a kind of audience you're targeting, you better make sure there's a way to verify that from a third-party standpoint. If you're promising that you're showing video, you better be having a third-party certification through your SDK or whatever that yes, this was viewed, and this is the viewability metrics for these things. So I think as time evolves, on many things like video and audience and all of that, those kinds of fraud are also, in my opinion, fraud. And it's important to sort of bring out ways to certify that and prove that you are in the right place there. So that's what I think.
Yeah. To that point, I think, as you said, it keeps getting more sophisticated, right? And we're looking at more areas. I think one of the things that also behooves us as an industry to do is to, for everybody to do a cost-benefit analysis, right? Of, I'm investing this much time and this much money into fraud. How much did that save me? And I think that's a very, it's kind of a colder, more pragmatic way of looking at it. But we've had, I've known brands that have done a similar thing with viewability, right? And you looked at it, it's like, I'm paying this much to track viewability. That found out that I saved $1,000, right? Let's choose a number. But I paid $5,000 to figure that out. And at some point, you think, like, what is the cost to you as a company? Is the cost of fraud baked into what you're doing? Yeah, and I think it's an uncomfortable subject because no one wants to say like, okay, fraud, it is what it is. Yeah. But it is, I think, with tools and time investment being what it is, I think that's a pragmatic thing that folks need to look into as well.
So let's actually talk about the timing involved, the amount of investment involved in fighting fraud, because as we're talking about, right, it's a tax on the industry. It's a tax on all of our time collectively to investigate, to fight it, and tax against us spending the time on the things that we want to do in terms of growing our businesses. So just to throw that question out there, right down the couch. So Will, from your perspective, the amount of time that you and your team spend dealing with fraud in any given week, how much time do you end up spending thinking about this or working on this?
I mean, frankly, I would say not enough. I think that right now we are, if you look at, if I graphed out how much time the staff was spending looking at fraud, it's just going up every week over week, month over month. And that's why I'm pushing. It's like, we need to move some of those hours into automated hours that will take that workload off of us. It's not going to be feasible to have people sitting around looking at fraud because it is too sophisticated. It changes too much. And you really need people with, I think, more of a technical background in it as well. Right now, you look at it, you have your normal, your usual media planners and buyers looking at it, right? Should it really be somebody more technical that can eventually down the line create an algorithm, create a program that can do it for us?
Yeah.
Got it. Piyush, from your perspective, how much time is your team and do you spend typically in a week figuring out fraud and working out how to fight it and how to combat it?
Well, I would say you never stop fighting fraud. It's been happening for like 7-8 years. It keeps changing. I would say we have a combination of man and machine. I mean, the man piece is important because there's a lot of other operation stuff that has to get done far more upstream at some level. So like a complete 24/7 diagnostic team and operations team that is tracking publishers and how these sort of publishers are getting on board. And at the same time, a whole technology team of about like 10 people who are building anti-fraud engines and technologies to make sure we can track these things. So I would say that has been a much more longer journey. I would say last couple of years is where there's been a lot more anxiety because advertisers have been a lot more questioning in the right fashion. So now the moment you utter the F word as a customer, I think people just make sure they come back and make that as a first priority. So it's a common thing. I don't think there's a percentage time. As ad partners, we've got to be more and more acute about it and not stop fighting it because it's not going to stop at all in any way.
Got it. I'll let you know what question is coming your way.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in terms of your team's investment, the amount of time that you're spending on this, and how much of your effort is spent dealing with fraud as part of your goals?
Yeah.
What would you say?
So, I think, to be honest, it used to be a lot more. We used to be juggling multiple ad networks, trying to dissect each one of them, seeing which one worked for us, and trying to juggle all these plates and that kind of stuff. And working with our agency, Fetch, who really have a support team for fraud there, we decided it wasn't worth our time, the time investment to really delve into this stuff. We pulled back with these networks because we just weren't seeing the benefit of spending all our time playing doctor and diagnosing all these issues and spending days and days and days looking at raw data, and in the end, we couldn't identify the specific source, or it would just pop up somewhere else. We're seeing publishers jump around between networks, and we were seeing that directly. And in the end, the game wasn't worth really playing, and we've kind of taken a step back and spent more of our time on places that work, like trusted partners that we know and we've had a long relationship with, and stuff we can have direct accountability with. So yeah, less now, to be honest.
Got it. So now, Piyush, you mentioned something earlier, which is an interesting topic, which is different kinds of ad units. So video specifically you brought up. And so how much does this equation change based off the type of advertising that's being run? Video specifically, how does this look differently in a world where advertising is done more and more in video versus other types of units?
Well, it does quite a lot. I mean, video specifically is a lot more amenable because it's more expensive, and people need to sort of be far more careful about it. So I think it's changed a lot more for video. I'll give a couple of use cases, one for the brand side and performance side. On the brand side, viewability is the antidote to fraud in video. And that's a huge thing because brands are spending a lot of eCPM dollars on per impression at some level. So unless you're really sort of working with partners who are more, I would say, a bigger footprint of SDK versus API, a lot of those viewability sort of things will not get clean enough. So that's one big area which ad partners need to invest in. The other areas, of course, on our performance side, where there's a lot of video being used for app installs, but one known thing is, of course, and we talked about that earlier backstage, is how much of the clicks are getting fired at different events, at quartile completion and stuff like that. That is really changing the whole attribution game at some level, and it's important that that is sort of arrested somehow, or there is some sort of consistency in the way tracking partners are looking at ad partners. So I think because of video, there's a lot more stuff happening, and it's very critical for people to arrest it through these standards I'm talking about.
Now, to Will and Ollie, if I'm, say, a new advertiser that's getting in this space, or a new agency that's getting more into the performance space, more into the growth space, and I had to get savvy about this. So I had to get savvy about what fraud means, what I need to look out for, how to be aware. Where should I start? What's the first thing I really need to know and look out for in order to get that level of savviness built up?
I think there are. Really, you can learn a lot. If you're just starting out, you can learn a lot from partners like in InMobi, right? They are at the forefront. Talk to, hopefully you know some people in the industry that can point you to trusted partners that can educate you about fraud. But I would say that one of the number one thing that somebody new to the game can really do, the best thing, is keep a skeptical mind, right? And I think it's very easy. As you said, we have very tough goals, right? But keep a skeptical mind. Use your own common sense. In real life, if you were somebody was trying to sell you for a Rolex for $50, you would know that ain't real, right? Yeah. But we run into these things where let's say you have a CPI goal of $1. Every partner is coming in at $4, $5, $6, and you have one partner that's coming in at 90 cents. Use a skeptical mind. That's probably too good to be true, right? And I know that everybody wants to rush to their boss and say, hey, look, we're beating your goal. Yeah. But you have to recognize that's probably not real. And I think that's the most important part, that understanding you're under a tremendous amount of pressure, but you have to be willing sometimes to say, no, this is not real.
Yeah, to your point, I think keeping a skeptical mind is key, and for us, and any new advertiser that's getting into space, lead from the analytics side. So have your analytics team there, monitor your organic install levels, see the relationship between your increase in paid and are your organic installs dropping off, monitor this campaign or network may be performing really well. Is all that performance coming from the installs that are happening 10 seconds after the click? Like the campaign as a whole may look great. There's easy pitfalls to fall into, like this is doing incredible, but really monitor where that's coming from, and do those paid installs you're looking at, do they look a little bit too much like organic behavior and that kind of stuff? So I think it's very easy to come up with a big result and like go headfirst in this space and get immediately some amazing quality installs that are, repeating and transacting in the app and continuing to be repeat users. But you really have to work with your analytics team to see, is there a correlation? Am I seeing a line between this paid and this organic access? And it's exactly what you said with the incrementality is, I think that's a key word for this stuff. And the way you're going to be using that is always be on top of the data and use, split your data carefully between organic and the type of page you're getting, whether that's from networks or other sources or your organic. Monitor the relationship between those, I would say.
Got it. Now, a topic we brought up a couple of times is the idea of advertisers and their partners working together. Will, you mentioned that as a way, again, to get in the space, to be able to develop that savvy, and Ollie, you mentioned the same thing about how you yourself have redirected some of your marketing effort to working with the partners that you trust. How would you say, when it comes to your relationships with your traffic sources, and I would love to hear from both sides of this, that those relationships have changed as a result of these fraud conversations? What do you think is the ideal way in which both supply and demand should be working together in light of, again, the challenges around this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think to steal a word from the keynote, it has been a very hostile conversation, right? I myself am guilty about it, of calling up a partner and raking them over the coals for some fraud that probably wasn't their fault, right? And I think that's a big way that we need to evolve our conversation. We need to stop being hostile between, the brand being pissed at the agency who rolls that down the line to the partner. And you got to recognize, hey, by and large, we're all in the same boat. We're trying to combat this, right? We keep getting more and more stringent about fraud. Like I've heard of, there are some relationships out there where if there is fraud, people are actually taxing their ad partner, saying, hey, if you have fraud, there's a fine of $25,000, right? How about instead of fining them $25,000, like, all right, say, hey, there was fraud. Instead of giving us $25,000, why don't you invest $25,000 in anti-fraud technology, right? Let's work on this together.
Yeah, I mean, I think our equations and discussions have dramatically changed, to be honest. And when it comes to the tracking partners, let's face it, I mean, everyone is learning at the same time. And a lot of those suites out there, and it's great to see the Tunes fraud prevention solution. I mean, we are really sort of working very closely with you guys and a couple of other players out there to really collaborate on what we have learned on the upstream side and help you sort of make a better tool on your side. Because eventually, unless you have done that piece at your end, I guess advertisers will not necessarily sort of have the confidence. So I think a lot of work is happening from our side with the partners of the tracking side. With the advertisers, I think it's more education. What does true incrementality really mean? What kind of metrics can we even work with you on? Because at some level, back to your point on whether it's really worth it or not, I think the whole discussion is, there is the KPI metrics of quality, ROI, at scale, and all of that, and there are these hygiene metrics that are important. And if you're working with 5 networks, and if they're all similarly and okay on the KPI side, I think the urge should be to make sure you at least start scoring them on the hygiene metrics also, so that there's some sort of effort. And the whole industry has to sort of bubble up those metrics a lot more, both upstream and downstream. And our effort has been to work closely with each and every important partner to at least educate and share everything we can do on how we have caught these things upstream and downstream, and how we're sort of working with them. So that's been that collaboration.
Cool. And to borrow another word from the keynote earlier, I would say my one thing is transparency for this stuff. I think there's a lot of not misinformation, but not an eagerness to share from either side, from advertisers, what our targets are, how aggressive we're being. I mean, that's what's driving this, is just a sheer appetite to spend and get return for this stuff. And that's why this whole issue exists, because there's a lack of education, like you said, and people are seeing great results. But I think in terms of transparency, people need to get smarter from all angles and really be able to go in with a surgical knife rather than a blunt weapon and like just completely knock down anything, and be able to get in there and work together to kind of weed out any specific black hat activities going on, and then we can actually have accountability for that rather than this kind of shroud of mysteriousness that comes from all these kind of activities. And at the same time, then we can work together with the ones that we know are white hat and the good guys again, and really build a kind of trust there. Because at the moment we are kind of stuck in almost a catch-22 where it's, we want to be able to work with networks and work together with agencies and networks and as the advertiser, but at the same time, at the moment, from an advertiser's point of view, I feel like we don't have the transparency there to really get in deep and work with you. It's an us versus them kind of thing, where hiding information on one side, trying to being too accusatory on the other side because we don't have any information. That's where we're at the moment. And I think for this to come together and us to move forward and make this an actual healthy industry, is we need to be transparent and open with that stuff, and we can really hold that guy who wakes up in the morning and thinks about fraud, him accountable, and get him out of our system and get him out of our kind of where we're spending and that kind of stuff, and work with the good guys. Yeah, definitely.
Got it. As I mentioned, Peter stole all of our best lines as part of the singing in the keynote this morning. But so I'm going to lead into probably the unfairest question of all, which is any question about the future and about where things are headed. And we're touching on this a little bit, but I would love to ask about if everyone here could articulate what the golden future looked like, a world in which we didn't have to worry about fraud, a world in which the incentives for fraud had been eliminated, or the ability to do fraud had somehow been marginalized, what that future looks like. And again, from each perspective. If we had work in a world where we didn't have to have panels like this because it was irrelevant, because it wasn't happening, what makes that future happen? How do we get there, and what would that world look like?
Yeah, I think in my mind, when you look at that type of future, it is that there are recognized tools that we all agree on that say, this is a real tool that is accurate, that measures and alert you for fraud. We've all agreed that this is what fraud is. These are the indicators this tool will tell you. There are actual metrics that are going to score partners, publishers on their fraud. And I think the other part of it, from a more human side, is going a lot to what you were saying about transparency, sharing of knowledge. It is that brands, agencies, partners start becoming more open about sharing these things. Every agency is learning the same thing at different times, right? And that puts us at a huge disadvantage to people that are trying to commit fraud. If you want to create a clickbot today, you can quickly Google that, and there will be people telling you how to make the best damn clickbot in the world. We're all hoarding knowledge, they're sharing, and that needs to change.
Well, I think for us and for me, the future is where it is not anymore a finger-pointing match and blame game, where accountability is coming in by a lot more, I would say, transparency. I mean, it's not a lot more objective, it's a lot more transparent. And if there's a way, and a lot of partners are doing it, where the so-called fraud value chain, right from the top, is able to sort of get measured, captured, tracked, and reported more liquidly by the tracking partners and all that, a lot of the transparency actually reduces the accountability burden per se. And I hate to sound like a victim, like a clean or honest ad partner, but I think the best thing that we can do together is to sort of bubble up this whole fraud value chain in ways that can help the entire industry as such. So I think that bubbling up from a transparency standpoint will reduce this accountability burden all of us have at some level. And the second thing I would say is, really from an advertiser standpoint, I know it's a lot of work, but really ask yourself, what is the true incrementality you're looking for? And demand that from your ad partners and attribution partners. And we all need to work together to make sure we can able to give that whole comfort to you at some level.
Yeah, I would echo those 2 points, definitely. I think transparency is going to be key. And I think, like in this future, without fraud, there's going to be some major differences. There's not going to be this huge burst or demand to spend. It's going to have to be smarter. It's going to have to be doing more innovation in the ad space rather than spamming ads whenever we can, forcing users to pop up ads or see ads wherever. Be smarter with it, start using video and be a bit more clever. Have the it won't be the same scale of inventory because, like I said, some of that stuff is just organic, that's just being tapped into right now, but it will be a smarter playing field where we can actually do stuff that works better for the customer rather than forcing them into clicking 10 ads accidentally or hammering their network or whatever's that. Actually get something the customer wants to see and they engage with it for real, with a real click, rather than 101 methods to fake a click or force a user to click. That's kind of where I'm at.
Got it. Good. Make good marketing by making good marketing.
Precisely. Seems simple.
So time for final thoughts. So, last statement when it comes to fraud, the industry, where we can go, what we can do. Will, what are your final thoughts on this, sitting here right now in, I believe it's July 2017?
It is, I guess. I think my final thought, I think it occurred to me while you guys were talking, about sharing, about transparency, let's do some public shaming, Let's create a social network where us as buyers, as trusted networks, where we put it out there, and you can anybody can tap in. It's like, hey, this network, we had a huge problem with them with fraud, right? That is going to, I think, have a huge impact if people can just look that up. We don't leverage that enough. On the sell side, there's things like Seller Crowd where you can go on and say, hey, this brand has a huge RFP out there. They have money. Go after them. Why don't we do the same thing? Hey, this network's full of fraud. Stay away from them.
I'd say maintain that fraud is not just a last mile problem. So the industry needs to make sure that the real thing below the iceberg needs to get bubbled up, and we've got to all solve for that right from the impression and request level. And I think it's important for us to solve that problem a lot more. One quick thing there, from an innovation standpoint, what you're trying to do is every impression in our case is idempotent. It cannot be reused. It's immutable, which means that everything down the path of a click or install or post on event can be mapped back to every unique impression at some level. So how do you sort of look at these things and make sure there's innovation happening? It's kind of a blockchain to some extent, where you're making sure the impression cannot be reused at some level. So I think a lot of these things, from a transparency standpoint, can be bubbled up. And then hopefully, I love what you just said. It'll be great for all of that to come together in some fashion. So.
From my point of view, as an advertiser, I would just encourage anyone who's kind of getting into this space, or because we forget, like you said, Will, that people are figuring this out at different times. We're not all at the same level we are here, or whatever that is. But I would encourage everyone, or wherever you are, every C-level, to go back to your head of marketing, work with your head of analytics, and actually it is worth the time to sit down, look at these great campaigns that are going, and take a deeper look into them and really examine, are you kind of mugging yourself off, basically, like just by great results that you can share with higher ups, but in reality, if you really get in there with a knife and dissect this stuff, it's not what it's really cracked up to be, and you're really just putting money in the pockets of black hat. And this is why it exists, because we obviously have some of the blame. We continue spending and seeing those great results, and the money goes to the people who are waking up and committing fraud. So I think I would just encourage everyone who's whatever stage you're at, just to go back and take another hard look at what you're doing in the mobile marketing space. Is it the right thing? And be a bit more selective, be a bit more skeptical, have a skeptical mind on everything you're doing in the mobile marketing space, because it is a tricky market, to be honest. It's a newer area compared to desktop. We're a desktop company originally, and that is a little bit more figured out. Mobile is still a little bit the Wild West for this stuff, and I think you have to treat it as such. And there's still plenty out there. It's just this stuff exists because we currently are a lot of people are uneducated, and there is a lack of transparency that people are not either asking for that information. This is happening more now, but even not asking or questioning, really, just a questioning mind for this stuff. So that's where I'd be at.
All right, let's hear a huge round of applause for our panel.